They called the valley Hartley Hollow because of the arroyo that cut a dark line through the prairie, and because my name was the only answer anyone could give when strangers asked who owned the place. I had been 39 when my husband, Tom, fell into the dry, clean dirt of the corral and didn't get up. I was 40 the winter the coroner's verdict came back, accident, in neat scrawled hand. I was 40 when the man who wrote the verdict put on a badge and a smile and offered to help me settle the estate. I was 40 when I learned how much a badge could silence a question, and how a badge could buy the silence of witnesses. Tom had been a slow man in some ways, a patient hand with the feedlot, the sort of man who'd mend a barbed wire fence until his fingers cramped, and then go sit on the porch and smoke a cigarette until the sun went down. He loved the land. He loved me. He taught me how to coax calves into a chute, and how to read the weather by the smell in the air. We had a mortgage on the land and a name on the deed together. After he was gone, I kept both names because changing them felt like admitting something permanent. The coroner's accident was a fall from a ladder in the barn loft. There were footprints in the dust the morning I found him, and Tom had been the kind of man who never took a ladder into the loft alone unless it was necessary. There were marks on the wood where someone had tried to steady themselves and failed. There was a witness who had seen a marshal, Silas Crow, out at night, lantern swinging like a threat, talking with men who rented corrals nearby. None of that mattered when Silas Crow pressed for the verdict of accidental death. He told the town a story that fit his hands and his advantage. Townfolk were tired, poor, used to doing what a badge told them to do. And my voice was a thin one in a room full of men who preferred neat endings. When the mortgage letter came, there were no comforting words, only numbers. When the bank showed up, it spoke like a man who'd never seen someone try to make a living off a stubborn bit of land and a name. The law that should have protected me was the law that took the most for itself first. I sat on a chair that had my husband's imprint in it, and felt the world scraping around me like a barn cat under a storm door. People think a widow becomes weak by choice, that the tears she sheds are a map drawn in ink and drop. They don't see the way the widow calculates like a chess player. I knew how to run cattle. I knew how to cure a fever with poultices and willow tea and steady hands. I knew how to raise a roof before a storm and how to coax seed into life. I knew how to balance the ledger even if the bankmen had to lift each page reluctantly. But I did not know how to wring justice from a man who had the law behind him. The night the stranger rode in, snow was thin on the ground, and the moon was a watchful coin. The horse was a gray and breathed steam like a curse. I was out by the barn because the roof had a new leak, and the weather came in like an accusation. I saw a flash of movement, then a man toppled from his mount with a grace that told me the fall was practiced. "Don't make a scene," he warned before I had a chance to call him names. He was youngish in a way that surprised me. Maybe he was 30. But the worry in his eyes spoke of women who wore shawls and older men who'd spent a lifetime betting against the world. He had a scar on one cheek and a limp that looked recent. When I stood on the loft ladder, he looked up at me from where he leaned against the bale, and I noticed his hands were calloused in a way that told me he wasn't a liar. Lawbreakers had hands like thieves. Farmers had hands like mine. "You want the sheriff?" I asked, because this was what a sensible woman asked. A reasonable question. "No, I want shelter for the night. Then I'll be gone." He breathed out the words as if they were difficult. "I'm wanted," he said, "by Silas Crow." My stomach folded itself into a memory. The name of the Marshal was like a bruise. "You're wanted by Silas Crow," I echoed, because the syllables tasted like iron. "That same Silas Crow who bent the coroner," he said. He didn't say it like a critic. He said it like a man who'd read a book with his own name haunted through the margins. He's after me for something I didn't do. The barn smelled of oats and horse and the dry sweetness of straw. It smelled like a life that refused to stop. I should have stood on my principle. I should have called in the marshal and let the law do what's right. But my husband's name was in the ledger, where right had been bled away. The law that Silas Crow wore had been the instrument that closed Tom's chest and opened someone else's hands to the deed of our land. If a man with a badge and a need were the kind to set a man on fire to keep his power, then the law was a furnace. I, who had been expected to sit and remember and weep, found myself considering the outlaw who had tumbled into my barn. I measured him the way I measured cattle and weather, by usefulness and danger. He could fight, and he could hide. He was hurt, and he was shaken. He had none of the polished flight of a man who'd been taught to run. Maybe he was a liar and a thief. Maybe he was a man who would put a bullet in my chest and take my land. But he also carried knowledge in his eyes. And when he named Silas Crow, his voice did not betray admiration. "Why come here?" I asked. "Why my barn?" He laughed. It was small and not unkind. "Because your brand is as plain as a flag," he said. "Hartley, folks know you're stubborn enough to keep a man honest. If the legend is right, you don't squeal unless the fire's hot on your heels." I bristled. My legend had been reduced to stubbornness, to a curiosity more suited to a proverb than a person. But in the space of that chilly breath, I felt something rearrange. Tom had taught me what fences to mend and what wounds to bind. The world that had taken him had not taken those lessons. If the Marshal had killed my husband to take my land, perhaps sheltering a man the Marshal wanted was more than mischief. It was a way to make the badge reveal its shape. "I'll let you stay till daylight," I said, "on one condition. You tell me the truth about Silas Crow." He met my eyes. "What you want to know?" Everything I wanted to say. I wanted to know why a man with a badge had killed my husband, whether the marshals who rode with him had been paid in cattle or favors, whether my name had been signed away with a promise as thin as a matchstick. Instead, I said, "What did Tom die for?" The outlaw's face went steady, like a hand that had put a knife in a sheath. "I'll tell you," he promised, "if you let me keep breathing." When I closed the barn door behind him, I felt like I had locked more than straw and man in the night. I had locked in a possibility, a dangerous-shaped thing that might be justice or might be ruin. My heart beat with something between hope and fear. I had been told to be quiet, to take what was dealt. I had been told to let men-in-law decide what's fair. I had been told that a woman's place in grief was to be small and good. I had a stove and 2 chairs and an unpaid mortgage. I had the kind of stubbornness that could make a fence stand for winter, and a mind that knew where to put a poultice. I knew how to make a barn into a refuge, and a name into a weapon if you knew how to swing it. That night I decided I would listen, and that my listening would be the beginning of something. I did not know then how wide that beginning would grow, only that in the quiet of the hay and the breath of the man resting his head on a saddle, I refused to make myself small. Daylight lifted the frost and painted the hollow in blue gentleness. I watched the outlaw sleep and counted the lines on his face like a farmer counts days until harvest. He introduced himself over coffee, black as a promise and twice as hot. He called himself Jacob Calloway, though I learned quickly to call him Jace because he liked the sound and it made conversation easier. Names matter when you are deciding what to trust. I gave him the bare facts, where the well was, which horse was broken, where the tools were kept. He gave me answers that were narrower than I expected and broader in their implication. "Silas Crow," he said, stirring his coffee. "He's not a lawman who keeps the peace. He's a fat man who keeps the power. He and his deputies run protection for the larger outfits. They take payments in cattle and deeds and promises. He'll kill to keep a story tidy." I did not like the way his mouth tightened around the truth. "Why would he want my land?" "Because your land sits on a strip a railroad wants," Jay said. "And because your husband, Tom Hartley, was asking too many polite questions. Not of the sort you might think. A farmer's curiosity, but questions that dug at an old scheme Silas and his men set up. Tom was getting close. It should have felt like vindication, someone naming the shape of my husband's death. But the naming was a different sort of wound, like a cut reopened to be washed. I had imagined big things like cattle rustling and small things like a bar fight. I had not imagined the deliberate hunger of a man who could shape law into a net. "You were running?" I asked. "When you rode in here, did you run because of the things you were accused of, or because you were running from a man who kills to keep the truth quiet?" "Both," he said. "I didn't ask for this life. I was a horsebreaker once, then a courier, then at times a hired hand who kept men out of trouble. I ran with men who killed without thinking. I left. When I tried to come back clean, I found Silas with a ledger open and my name in it. He framed me to keep me from talking. When I saw Tom arguing with a man from the station house 3 weeks before he died, I thought maybe he was sticking his nose into a fight he couldn't win. I tried to warn him away. I failed. Some mornings, the truth feels like a hard bread you have to chew slowly. I chewed. My fingers found the scar along my thumb where Tom used to press his lips before we argued and made up. I had to be practical. The outlaw was wounded in the leg, a limp that would cripple a man on the run if it wasn't tended. I had a stock of ointments and the steady hands that knew how to set a pulled muscle and bind a wound with linen. I didn't offer heroics, I offered competence. He accepted. "You're not the first woman to take in a man like me," Jace said later, watching me curry a horse. "But you're the first who offered ointments before a sermon. Serum and whiskey do better than fire and brimstone most nights," I said. "When you asked for shelter, I heard the badge that chased you. I heard the name that made my husband's death into a neat paragraph in a ledger. That meant something to me. We made a fragile pact. I would hide him within the barn and tend his wound if he stayed out of sight during the day. He would teach me things he knew that could help. How to read a tracker's spoor, how to set an ambush if it came to that, how to ride so the horse would not tire. He promised, not go poking his nose in places unless I asked him to. There is a particular kind of trust that grows from shared need. It is not the sweet innocence of love at first sight, but the hard-headed intimacy of two practical people learning the same language. He was not just a man I hid. He was a resource and a mirror. When he watched me stitch up a wound with my father's curved needle, his eyes softened. He learned to read the red of a fever and the pale of a woman who had not slept. I learned to read the tilt of his jaw when he thought a lie might save us and the crack in his voice when he mentioned Tom by name. "You could ride south," I suggested once. "Cross the state line. They don't track every horse." "Not with my leg, not with Silas's men looking for any trail a stranger left," Jace said. "Besides, you're the sort of woman who asks too many questions about her husband's death for me to keep walking away." He spoke it with no romance. And yet the notion of sticking around my place, an unromantic ranch with a stubborn widow and a mortgage, felt to him like an odd sort of sanctuary. He was practical. He wanted to clear his name, or at least to make it unprofitable for Silas to hunt him. I was practical. I wanted to know what my husband had died for. The convergence of our needs made an alliance that was precarious but real. It didn't take long for me to find my own strength in the equation. Feeding someone who had been a fighter gave me a reason to move faster, to mend the roof, to double down on the ledger entries Tom had left. I told him about the land survey tucked in Tom's desk, about a lawyer who had been polite to my face but sharp with his pen. I told him about the neighbor women who came for eggs and talk, who stitched fancy patterns into blows, and could keep a secret because they'd kept their own. In return, Jace taught me to listen to footprints. He showed me how to test the soil for the passage of a horse, and how to tell if tracks were newer than morning. He taught me to hide a rifle under a sack of seed so that a deputy could be surprised by something he had not paid for. He did not try to take my choices away. He deferred when I told him the barn was my sanctum. "You're not looking for a man to blame," he said one day, as we patched the fence he had leaned against and broken with his weight. "You're looking for truth." He was right, and he was not. I wanted truth, yes. I wanted to hold the man who had put his badge over a body accountable. I wanted to keep my land, but I also wanted my voice back. I had been quieted by grief and by men who used uniform as a hammer. The alliance did not turn me into a follower. It turned me into someone with a practical ally who respected the lines I drew. By the time the snow lifted, our accord had deepened into shared habit. He brought me stories of men who paid in cattle and women who sold their favors for safety. I brought him the knowledge of the land and the names of the women who would not put up with Silas's brand of law. We tested each other's boundaries. He promised never to pull a gun unless I asked. I promised never to betray his trust unless he broke the code that matters most to me: truth. We survived on mutual competence, not on romance. It was a healthier thing for both of us. And in the small things, mending a split board, sharing a bowl of stew, staying awake together through the sound of wolves, we built a foundation that would be harder to shake than fear. By the time spring unrolled like green ink across the prairie, Hartley Hollow had begun to breathe again. I found, with a quiet wonder that would have made Tom laugh, that something about keeping my hands busy kept my mind from cartwheeling into the worst of memories. The chores were loud and demanding and honest. They didn't take questions from a man in a badge. They answered to seasons and the stubborn logic of life. I worked as I always had, before grief had tried to own me. I fed calves, looped ropes, and wrote the ledger in a hand that Tom would have recognized. But the inside of me shifted. Where I had kept my thoughts small and private, I now found a willingness to plan. I mapped out the fence lines that needed strengthening. I measured the pasture and figured a way to rotate the herd to preserve the winter feed. Practicalities, yes, but they returned me to a version of myself I had once liked. The woman who could keep a ranch a step ahead of ruin. Jace watched me at work as if he were learning an art. "You have a way," he said one afternoon as I worked a stubborn mule into a harness. "A way of doing things that makes the land listen." "It's called knowing when a beast is frightened and when it's plain stupid," I retorted. "And it's called getting tired of doing things halfway." The hurt in him flared and subsided like weather. With medicine learned from Tom's old book and remedies I had bargained for with a peddler, I tended Jace's leg until his limp came back only on damp mornings. He took up jobs around the hollow, mending fences, helping bring in calves, fixing a wheel on the Miller girl's buggy. He did not hide in the loft as the warm weather coaxed people out into the world. He joined it. He learned to graft an apple branch and to trim a wound so it would not scar into an infection. Safe haven, I discovered, was not a place as much as a rhythm. We improvised a routine. He rode into town only rarely, with a bit of a limp covered by a wide-brimmed hat and a smile that fit like a borrowed coat. I kept the ledger closed to strangers. I kept the barn quiet on certain nights. Women came by with quilts and gossip. They were good at both. Mrs. Keegan next door brought over biscuits and a story about a deputy who had been asking too many questions about my mortgage. Older women gave advice in the currency of recipes and remedies, and younger women looked at me with a respect that warmed like sun. I started to think about a future. Not the romantic future people in dime novels threw around, but a ledger with years written on it, a mortgage paid, a porch in better repair, a field that would feed a family. I planned how to sell a calf to extra profit, how to pay the lawyer a small sum to lodge a petition, how to keep the taxman at bay for a season. I realized that the greatest theft done to a woman like me wasn't the loss of a husband. It was the theft of possibility that followed. Because the world assumes a widow's options are few. Jace listened. He didn't tell me my dreams were foolish. He offered methods. If you could make it look like someone is stealing from Silas, you can make him spend resources, he suggested. Men like him get careless when they think they have nothing to lose. You make him think he has something to lose. We're not thieves, I said. We are trying to stay alive. You're practical, he said. So am I. Practical sometimes means picking a lock rather than burning a barn. Practical means making him look like the desperate man he already is. It was in those small conspiracies that I saw my own cunning take shape. I thought like a woman who had learned that the law would not always be fair, but that it relied on proofs. If Silas had taken Tom's life to secure land for the railroad, then the proofs lived in books, in ledgers, in persons who did not speak without cause. I had a list of names Tom had kept in his ledger. Men who had signed for hay, men who had come around with questions, men who had smiled politely and left with a slant of shadow. I began to dig. It started with small things. A postmarked letter Tom had saved. A receipt signed at a hotel in town that put a man in Silas's employ, in the company of a known contractor. Each scrap was a stitch. I worked because it soothed me. I worked because it made me useful in a world that had told me I was useless. There were moments that threatened to topple me. In the middle of one long night, a deputy came with a question about a missing mare. He was drunk on duty and mean with a sort of official contempt. He asked about Tom with a particularly cruel grin. I let him ask. When he sneered about a widow's place, I almost hit him with the iron poker. I didn't. I used my hands in a different way. I handed him a warm pie and sent him on his way with a polite falsity, then got my ledger and wrote down every word he used, every accusation. I kept my temper measured. I used my wits. That night I realized that rage was a fuel, but only when guided by plans. We had small victories that were private and satisfying. A neighbor who had been hesitant about speaking to me offered to sign her name to a statement about seeing men from the Marshal's office moving supplies at night. A feed store owner admitted that he had sold Silas a rope in a hurried buy, and that the rope came from a shipment earmarked for the railroad's camp. The net of little facts began to hold. And Jace, he taught me courage as an everyday thing, not the dramatic bravery of riders and ballads, but the steady grit of someone who came to the manger and fed the animal in the rain. He showed me how to ride hard when the weather turned, and how to sit with a wound until it healed. He became a partner in the narrow sense that he'd steady me on ladders and take the worst chores when my back protested. He didn't save me, he shared the burden. That was important. One afternoon, when the sun flattened the fields into a sheet of glass, I walked to the bar where men gathered to make bets and speak of plows. Jace said nothing. He watched from a shaded doorway. "You sure?" he asked. "You think I'd walk into danger because I enjoy a drink?" I snapped. "No. I go because I am the sort of woman who learns what men say when they think no woman listens." I sat and let them hear me. It felt strange and good to have a voice that was not apology. I asked questions. I let them underestimate me. A town councilman laughed at a woman's worry, and then he squinted when it turned out I knew the names of the men he had been protecting. I returned home with more names and a ledger that was filling with the thing I wanted more than revenge: evidence. That night, Jace sat on the porch steps and watched the stars. And I sat beside him not because I hoped for romance, but because the rhythm of two people who had chosen to stand together felt like the first law I'd ever learned that I could trust. He didn't say, "You owe me." He didn't take my hand without asking. He offered his shoulder when I wanted to lean. I realized with the blunt efficiency of someone who had learned to do what must be done, that I was becoming a woman who wouldn't be ordered into a corner. I was becoming a woman who could stand in the middle of a field and make a decision and hold to it. It was a strange and wonderful thing. There are stories that are told to make a man into a monster, and stories that are told to make him into a hero. Jace's was messy, not the kind of legend the town could put a frame on. He had been a horsebreaker, a courier, a man who'd carried messages and sometimes carried trouble. He had done things he wasn't proud of. He didn't hide them from me. He told them in the small way a man tells you when he wants you to know the whole of him, not for confession, but for truth. When I left, he said one night by the cook stove, the light making his eyes small and honest, I went to the ledger men keep. I saw names in a column that matched receipts Tom had mentioned. I pulled at a thread and, he frowned, as if remembering pulling something that had been rusted to bone. I should never have pulled. He told me about a scrawl in a county ledger where names and numbers were swapped like cattle in a list. He showed me the way a corrupt sheriff signs documents. A hand that thinks itself careful enough to hide beneath the paper but is thick with ink, in the same way his men were thick with greed. He had been part of the operation that moved cattle and paperwork and occasionally bodies out of sight. He left because he couldn't live with it. I listened hard because his story did something crucial. It turned his criminal skills into instruments I could use without being criminalized. His knowledge of the Marshal's moves, the way Silas liked to meet contractors at dawn, the deputy who kept the ledger in his boot, the bribed clerk who had the key to records, became part of a plan rooted in evidence, not vengeance. If we could retrieve a ledger or a receipt, we could make Silas accountable in the clean light of the law. It was odd and important that the man the law labeled outlaw knew how to pull the law's strings. He taught me tactics that were necessary and practical. He showed me how to shadow a man without being noticed, how to fetch a ledger when the clerk expected someone he loved, how to read the hour a door would be unlocked. We mapped out Silas's habits like a surgeon mapping arteries. For every corrupt routine we identified, we wrote down a counter. I became the planner. He became the one who showed me which back roads to take. The first time his knowledge bore fruit, it felt like opening a locked drawer and finding a letter inside. A deputy who had been bribed to move records into a deputy's trunk left the trunk jarred open for a minute to run into the saloon. Jace noticed because he had ridden with these men once and could smell their pitch. We had prepared. I sat at the wagon in the lane while he slipped, careful as a fox, into the deputy's shed. He found a ledger tucked behind a false board, the ink still damp with records that matched the receipts Tom had kept. It was the kind of paper that could sour a man's career or send him to jail if handed to the right person. Jace brought the ledger to me, and for the first time in a long time I felt the drum of righteous blood in my veins. The thing we held in our hands was proof that the Marshal operated with the casualness of men who thought themselves above consequence. We did not show the ledger to every friend. We learned a stern discipline in the way a woman learns not to let talk run like a sore. We tested the paper against other proofs. A hotel bill turned up in a man's trunk, a horseshoe with the stamp of a contractor's stable. Piece by piece, the story of Silas's trade gathered itself into a case. "Why didn't you come clean?" I asked Jace one night, a question that had been waiting like a coal beneath the ash. "I tried," he said. "I told a judge in the town over. The judge took bribe money from men who'd rather a bad man stay out of sight than a true man be heard. I learned quickly that the law in certain counties was a fence you could not climb without a ladder of money. I left not because I'm coward, but because I thought leaving would keep others safe, and because I had to learn a better way to fight." His words settled into me like a pattern. He had been on the inside. He had been one of those men who could turn a wheel and grease the axe. The difference between then and now was choice. He had chosen to walk away, and in doing so, he had armed himself with knowledge that allowed us to fight back. Throughout this time, his respect for me grew in a way that did not patronize. I could feel it in the quiet of his attention, in the way his hand went still when I made a plan, and in the way he deferred to my judgment when my asking made the risk clear. He never suggested a plan that took my land out of my hands. He advised, he answered, he adapted. "You're not just a woman who keeps a ledger," he said once when I showed him a list of men who'd played parts in Silas's deals. "You're a woman who keeps a ledger and has the patience to make it speak." We used the outlaw's skills to assemble our case. Jace used his knowledge of the Marshal's roots to create diversions and to gather statements. He moved like a shadow in the town and returned with names and bits of truth. He did not court romance. His devotion was to the cause. That suited me. I had need of a partner in battle, not a suturing of my wounds by a man who thought me broken. There was a moment when Jace and I realized that our efforts had begun to unsettle Silas. A deputy stumbled into town bragging about how the Hartley place was watched. Men who had been suppliers to Silas became suddenly too busy to help him. Paperwork went missing in his office. He lashed out with a violence that was blunted by the fact that the ghost of Tom's case was not entirely a ghost anymore. It stirred in people a hunger for answers. Silas's reaction told me two things. First, that he believed he was being threatened in a way he could not control. And second, that we had leverage. Power doesn't like being exposed. It slinks. It frets. It makes mistakes. For Jace, those mistakes were both a risk and a salvation. He had run from Silas before and paid with exile. Now, because he had chosen to stand with me, he risked more than his freedom. He risked a woman's future. He risked a prize he had never thought he deserved. Someone who could see him whole and still decide to stay. That was the subtle change. His outlaw skills, his history of wrongdoing did not wash away. They became tools for me to use, to assemble a story that would stand in court. The man beside me acknowledged the power of my choices. The outlaw's past served the Hartley present. In all of it, I held the center. I was not following him. I was leading the charge with an ally who had the knowledge to make that charge cunning and effective. Grief can be a fog that softens edges so that you cannot see what is real. It can also be a lens that sharpens detail until a man's lies look like constellations. For months, I held both. The ledger, the receipts, the hotel invoices. Each piece of paper was a notch in a belt that would one day loop around Silas's neck. But proofs don't mean much until you decide what justice looks like. Tom had not been a man who would want blood for blood. He was a man who wanted his name to mean something, who wanted his land to feed us, and maybe, if luck favored him, a niece in town to have a better life. He wouldn't have marched a posse with cries of vengeance. He would have sought fairness. That realization shaped my aims. I did not want to be a woman who became what she despised. I wanted law. I wanted land. I wanted a future that bore Tom's face not as a relic but as a foundation. Silas's theft had been methodical. He'd worked with contractors who wanted the railroad's right-of-way. He had the authority to call down citations and to arrest troublemakers. In exchange, he took a cut of the cattle and payments disguised as storage fees. Some men complied because they feared jail. Others because a man with a badge is persuasive. The ledger we had whispered of late-night deals and cattle driven off to contractor lots. Tom had stumbled across it because he was stubborn enough to keep an eye on his neighbors and to ask the right kind of questions. When I thought about my husband's face, the urge to tear something apart rose in me. Rage is an old, honest thing, but it becomes useful only when guided by purpose. I had a plan to make the small pieces I had into a whole, to present the ledger to a judge outside Silas's influence, to get depositions from men who'd been paid under the table, to show how Tom had been silenced. But the law is not a clean instrument in a place where the sheriff writes his own rules. To survive, I needed to know the terrain. I needed allies beyond the barn and beyond the hollow. I needed women who would stand with me when a town might prefer silence. I began to speak to women more openly. I was measured in my words, the way one measures sugar for a syrup. Mrs. Keegan told me about men who had been late with payments to Silas, and how a deputy had threatened her husband. A young girl who worked in the hotel kitchen admitted that a contractor had given her money to keep her mouth shut, the sort of hush that women traded for rent. Each confession was flinched out of fear, not from bravado. To each woman, I gave a ritual: food, a chair, a warmth, and I asked for truth. "Why are you telling me this?" one asked, eyes round. "Because I don't want this in the ledger of my chest," I said. "Because Tom is not in here to ask, and I am. Because you've been hurt, and we will be safer if we tell it so it can be righted." The first sign that we were making a dent was a deputy's confession in a sober hour at the feed store. He had been moved by my constancy, or perhaps by the ledger's reputation. He named places and dates and men. We took his confession to a judge 2 counties over, a man who did not take kindly to Silas's money. When we handed him the ledger and the statements, his face had a kind of startled respect. "You're taking a dangerous road," he warned me in a private room, pen tapping. "If you proceed, there will be consequences." "Consequences we accept," I said, the words tasting like coal. "Tom is dead for reasons that can be shown. I don't want to ruin a man for the sake of cruelty. I want him held accountable. If that means the law bites back on itself, then let it." I could see the judge's calculations like a man squinting at the horizon. He agreed to issue a warrant for Silas's arrest only if we could present depositions that could not be dismissed as gossip. We had depositions, but they would be dismissed if people recanted under pressure. The problem with men in power is that they know how to make folk retreat. That's when I made my hardest choice. I decided we would not only file papers, we would force Silas into daylight by making public what he had done. We would show the community what a man in a badge could do when left to his own devices. It was a dangerous move. It risked my mortgage, my safety, and the delicate peace of a valley that liked its cows quiet and its women silent. But I had Tom's memory like a map. I had Jace's dark skill and the ledger that would make the seeing official. I had women who were tired of being afraid. I had made friends with a lawyer in the next county who would not take a bribe if it meant his reputation. I had made a choice. We would not let men dictate what's true by fiat. Word got out. People began to look sideways at Silas as he roamed the main street with a swagger that had been his armor. He grew crueler, small in the ways corrupt men do, checking houses at odd hours, humming a song about order to frighten women. One night he barged into my yard, a repo man with a badge, and wanted to search my barn because he heard a rumor about men hiding out. He barked and demanded, and he had men with him. They came like vultures. I met him on the porch. He had the smile of a man who thinks he has you pitted. "You've stirred the bees, Mrs. Hartley," he said. "You keep stirring and you'll find you've made enemies of those who will not be kind." "You've already made one man's death a matter for your ledger," I answered. and you will answer for it." He stepped toward me like a man testing the weight of a grievance. My hands went to the rail, to the cool wood that had held me through storms. I did not back away. Around us, the wind sighed as if impressed that I would not flinch. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, voice low, "you're a widow. Keep the farm and be grateful. Or fight me and see what happens to the barn." I measured my answer like a farmer measures seed. "You mean to scare me," I said. "You think a woman with a mortgage and a widow's sorrow is a simple thing to cow. I can sell a cow. I can borrow against my upcoming yield. I can make the ledger of my life speak. And when I do, you'll find nothing in it to justify a badge. You'll find only a plain woman who liked her husband and wants the truth." He laughed then. A small, cruel thing. He left, and with his leaving came the grinding hollow of a town that prefers shadows to daylight. The war was not romantic. It was paperwork and threats and late-night visitors who left mud on my porch. Men I had counted as neighbors closed their doors. It was a lonely road, but in every dark corner of that loneliness, I found energy. Rage walked beside me like a mule, stubborn and willing to work. I chose to fight not because I wanted vengeance, but because I wanted to be free of the theft. I wanted to make clear to every widow and every woman that had been told to keep quiet that voices could be assembled into law. I did not want to be the voice of one. I wanted to be the center of a choir that could not be ignored. And Jace, he took his risks with a kind of focused calm that steadied me. He did not try to rescue me because he had learned the wrongness of that. He stood beside me as an experienced partner, and that made all the difference. When the Marshal's men came with veiled threats, he counseled strategy. When I needed someone to stand in the town center and speak truth into ears hardened by ingratitude, he rode with me. He brought skill. I brought the rightness of a woman who refused to be silenced. As the ledger's shadow spread into the light of courts and men who could not be bought, silence turned to whispers, and those whispers began to gather. The battle had been chosen. The war was on. I had taken my truth and with practical stubbornness, turned it into fight. There was a respect between Jace and me that felt like well-made leather. It held under weight and softened with use. He never tried to make decisions for me. He offered counsel like a man offering a finely sharpened knife. I had, in turn, begun to rely on his experience with the kinds of men who think themselves unassailable. We wrote strategies together, not as commander and soldier, but as two people aligning strengths. In a council of two, we mapped out the course we would take. He knew the Marshal's routes and how the deputies timed their cash runs. I knew the ledger and the names that could be brought forth. We decided to press our case with paper and witness, while simultaneously undermining Silas's practical ability to act. We sabotaged his immediate authority carefully, nothing that would ruin a man's life with vengeance, but enough to expose the cracks in his empire. We set traps that were legal in intent, creative in execution. A deputy who had been moonlighting would be offered a seemingly lucrative protection job that would take him away during an important meeting, leaving only a clerk to hold the records. Jace and I would then collect the documents and walk them to the judge beyond Silas's reach. It required a choreography of rides, timing, and women's attention, so the movement looked like ordinary business, which was how we hid the extraordinary. At night, he would sit on the stoop and we'd talk. Not about plots, but about what we would do with our lives if justice came. For me, it was practical. Pay the mortgage, repair the roof, maybe hire a boy to drive the feeder route. For him, it was something quieter. A wish to leave the rough life he'd led and find a place that would accept the whole of him, the good and the wrong decisions he'd made and owned. "You could run," I suggested once, tasting the small hope of something like an ordinary life. "We could move. There's land in Colorado cheap if you know where to look." "I could," he said, "but I don't know if a running man can ever be sure of quiet." "You don't run from your decisions anymore," I said. "That's different." He admired my stubbornness and learned in his own slow, careful way how to be patient with it. He did not romanticize my widowhood into a contest of saving and being saved. He treated me like the partner I had become. Sometimes that meant a rough humor at my expense. Hartley stubborn, he'd call me from across the corral with a grin. But the humor never crossed into belittlement. It was the sort of affection that honored my agency. We tested our plan in small ways. A man who had been too afraid to sign a declaration stepped forward when he realized Silas's open threats were becoming bad for business. A store owner in town who had supplied Silas with bribes was worried his customers were aware. Piece by piece, we turned the town's apathy into interest. Women who had been afraid, Mrs. Keegan, a seamstress named Ruth, and the hotel cook, Eliza, began to keep watch and gather statements. They were as careful as any man with a badge would be, and more useful, because their kindness could wear another man's suspicion down. The romantic thread that sometimes binds a woman to a man came slowly, and not because I needed to be made whole. It grew in the space of mutual respect, me making choices, and him learning to be brave in the ways I needed, not the ones he preferred. He learned to check his impulses to do the dangerous thing first. I learned to let someone else carry the heavier pail when my back needed support. We shared tasks and laughter. We shared the silence of two people who had both lost and found a reason to stand again. There were tender moments, his hand finding mine without pretense while we read a testimony by candlelight. A day when he promised to teach me a new hitch for tying loads that I had never considered. A night when I saw him sit on the fence and watch the sun drop like a coin behind the range and knew he thought a little about a life with a woman who could run a ranch. We did not speak of marriage. The idea felt too small for both of us and too bound by the law we were trying to make hold. We spoke of partnership, in business and in life, and the notion suited us better. He had faults, and I named them: his impatience, his tendency to see threats where I saw strategy, his old habits that could slide back into violence if left unattended. He did not resent the naming. He worked at his temper like a man learning to mend a fence in winter. And I had my own stubbornness, my inclination to push the plan until it broke, and then push harder. He tempered that. Our faults fit together in a way that made us stronger. We taught each other more than practicalities. He taught me how to look at a man's gait and guess his confidence. I taught him how to negotiate with a banker and how to fill out a ledger properly. He taught me to be more daring in small ways. I taught him patience in the large ones. He began to trust that the woman who spoke loudly in court had a soft hand at the corral. I learned to trust that the man with a scar on his cheek could be steady when the stakes were real. The town began to notice the shift. Silas's swagger reduced to a stiffened walk. Deputies were less certain. The judge who had taken our papers called a hearing date. We had the right people ready to testify. It was the balance between his knowledge of the rougher tactics and my expertise in securing documents and witnesses that made our plan work. When people asked how a widow had managed to stir a town, I could say it was the ledger and the courage of a few women and an outlaw who didn't like to be hunted unjustly. But I knew another truth. It was the equality between two people, both skilled and flawed, both learning to lean on one another without losing themselves, that had given us leverage. We were partners because we chose to be and because we honored each other's agency. That was part of the victory I wanted. If we won, it would be because a woman's choice had guided the fight, not because a man had decided to rescue her. There are crossroads that come not once, but in a full sprawl. I sat at one of those crossroads, a ledger before me and a horse tied in the yard, and I had to make a decision that would shape not only my life, but the lives of the women who had begun to look at me as a model for defiance. The judge had set a date for depositions. The town buzzed with rumors. Silas predictably grew erratic. He sent men to canvass the hollow, to make polite inquiries at dusk. He whispered to people at the saloon. He tried to use fear as a tax. And then he did something cruder. He confiscated a crate of horses intended for a contractor, claiming they were evidence in a roundabout matter. The contractor complained loudly. The contractor was one of Silas's secret allies who signed deeds in the night. I saw the contract and realized Silas was using his power to pressure subcontractors, to make them cut deals to keep their animals and their reputations safe. It was the kind of petty tyranny that irked me more than threatened me. I could have taken the route the judge suggested, filed an injunction, waited the slow teeth of the law. I could have ridden away and let someone else take the fight. Or I could do something bolder and risk the safety I'd clawed back. This was the choice. Safety for my future or justice that exposed a man and possibly harmed me in the process. I thought about Tom, his quiet laugh, the way he whistled over mending a fence. I thought of the neighbor women whose hands shook when they gave me testimony. I thought of the ledger's weight and how we had turned it into a weapon made of paper. When I measured the cost of inaction, the number was clear. Silencing truth would cost more lives in the valley than mine alone. The choice was ugly and necessary. That evening, Jace and I rode to the town where the contractor lodged a complaint. He could have insisted on doing the dangerous part. He could have stormed the marshal's office like a man in a ballad, but he didn't. He asked me what I wanted to do. The manner was almost quaint in its courtesy, asking a woman his life could touch what she desired. I said we would go into the town square quietly and demand a public counting of records. The audacity delighted and frightened me in equal measure. We made a plan, gather a few voices, create a spectacle big enough that other men would be compelled to take a stand, and force the issue into public eyes. Jace used his knowledge of routes to foresee how Silas might respond, and I used my relationships to ensure witnesses and women were present. It was a union of strategy and grit. We rode in with quiet resolve. The town square, which had seen fewer and fewer disputes lately, became a stage. I stood beside the ledger and asked, plainly, for the marshal to produce receipts that tied him to his claims about the horses. He laughed. He had the kind of laugh worn by men who think they are jokes that the world must listen to. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "you're stirring trouble you can't understand." "Understand this," I answered. "Either you own up to your misdeeds, or you'll face consequences the law will allow. I will not be bullied." He threatened to arrest us for disrupting peace. The crowd, sparse but growing, watched. Men shifted uneasily. Some were sympathetic. Others watched the fight as if it were a match a spectator paid to see. Women clustered at the edges, steady and grim. The choice I had made had transformed into a moment of testing. If Silas played his hand with brute force, the outcome might end in violence. If he backed down, then the ledger and the testimony might function as law. Either way, my resolve was being examined. He called for deputies. Jace stepped beside me, not between me and the marshal, but by my side. He did not take my hand unless I reached for it. He respected that the decision to stand in the square had been mine to make. It was one of those small, essential things, one of those ways a man respects a woman's agency that matters when the moment is real. In the space between the marshal's threat and some kind of action, a voice rang out. It was the contractor's voice, brittle and surprised, raised in a complaint not of loyalty, but of self-interest. Men began to murmur. A clerk from the marshal's office, who had been suspiciously quiet, stepped forward and asked if he might see the ledger. The ripple began. We might have had silence. We might have had guns. Instead, what took us all by surprise was that the community, tired of being buffeted by Silas's braggadocio, began to shift. The old fears did not vanish, but they were matched by a clear, growing disgust. The halt of men who had been complicit became evident. Our plan, staged like a rod through the beast, had done its work. It made Silas uncomfortably visible. He could have arrested me then. He could have cracked me with a public show of force. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, the world took its own counsel. The choice I had made, safety aside, justice up front, had made a difference. It did not make the battle won. It only made it a fight that would be seen. In the quiet afterward, while the town breathed again and people filed back to their shops, Jace slid his hand into mine, a light, respectful acknowledgement of the courage I had decided on without his coercion. He did not claim me because I had chosen danger. He admired me because I had chosen in a way that showed who I was becoming. That night, as we sat by the stove, he turned to me. "You could have left," he said, voice careful. "I could also have lived with a death I didn't understand," I answered. "And I choose my husband's memory over my fear." He hunched, as if considering the scale of that choice. And then he nodded. "Then we'll keep choosing," he said. "Together, if you'll have me. Together." The word sat between us like a promise, but without hinge. I could accept the partnership and still be the woman who made the call. I could love him and still be strong. I had that day chosen justice over the easy lane. It was not a romantic flourish. It was the work of a woman who had learned to measure risk and to live by her choices. The moment of choice had been mine, and I had chosen well. When a small town smells fear, it fans like dry grass. Men with badges who had been on Silas's payroll grew more cautious, and in their caution made mistakes. Deputies began to take secret payoffs from contractors who thought they could hedge bets both ways. Hands that had been steady in corrupt comforts found their compass changed by the public attention. Silas, furious and cornered, grew crueler. His retaliations were small at first. An anonymous letter, a rustled herd at the edge of Hartley Hollow. But cruelty became bullying, and bullying became direct threat. He tried to silence us through those he thought most vulnerable. He summoned the bank manager who had given me a small credit line and hinted about liabilities. He went to the judge's chamber and tried to buy the silence of the clerk who had been the weak link in the ledger chain. When those minor briberies failed, he took a more dangerous tack. He leaned on a man in my employ, a hired hand named Will, and pressured him to testify that I had orchestrated cattle rustling to get sympathy. Will came to me, eyes wide, pushed by fear. He told me that the deputy had threatened his family. He had been told to make false testimony unless he wanted his wife punished at the mill. The law that had been an instrument was being wielded as a weapon of intimidation. The sight of a man frightened into lying hurt like a knuckled blow, but it also filled me with a fierce clarity. Silas was terrified not only of losing face but of losing leverage. He would do whatever it took. We had armored ourselves with paperwork, but the human price shifted the ground. I could take a legal route, but it would not protect those Silas intimidated. I had to reckon with both the practical evidence and the lives at risk. I understood then that justice is not only a thing of courtrooms, it is the safety a woman feels when she steps onto her porch and a husband whose death has been acknowledged. We planned carefully. Jace and I decided to remove the most vulnerable from Silas's immediate reach while we pressed the case. Will's family left town under the pretense of visiting kin. I arranged for a neighbor to take Will's children and to keep their names far from prying ears. The kindness of small towns can be quiet and fierce. Women in the community, Ruth and Eliza in particular, pulled together blankets, food, and a small purse of coins so Will's family could find stable work elsewhere for a season. It was an act of female solidarity that felt like armor. But solidarity did not stop Silas from escalating. He began to plant rumors about me in the saloon, about my well-timed grievances, about a woman who had a ledger and a temper. A slander campaign is the oldest tool a bully has. Men who would not sign a paper would listen to gossip with greedy ears. It worked on some. Mrs. Miller, whose husband sold to Silas, was frightened into a public retraction of her earlier support. The town's pulse quickened. Then came the thing I had long feared. A man I had thought an ally. A neighbor who had once paused to share a bourbon on my porch turned. He was easy to read once you knew the shape of his fear. He wanted to keep his cattle, and Silas had whispered a promise. He signed a false affidavit that placed me in the barn the night I had sheltered Jace, accusing me of hiding criminals on my property. Watching the betrayal rooted inside me like salt. That night I could hear the hollow scraping of the barn siding in the wind and felt the weight of it. It would be easy to collapse into bitterness. I almost did. But bitterness has a way of making one small. I was not going to be small. I had learned so much about the ways the law can be molded. I had learned how to use truth as a tool. I would not let one man's cowardice reduce the work we had done. I called the women together. We sat in Ruth's parlor, the lamps low, and told each person what had been done. I laid out the false affidavit like a coin. I then proposed a set of countermeasures that were, in the essence, simple. Gather more witnesses, provide alibis, create an unmistakable narrative so the falsehoods could not stand. We would make rumor less effective by telling the truth loudly. We would organize a rotation so the vulnerable were never alone. We would make sure people knew that the harm to Will's family came from Silas, not from me. Women showed up with a force I hadn't fully anticipated. Eliza's hands were calloused from hauling water, but she had a voice that could be heard in a room. She went to the hotel and spoke plainly to the cook she knew had overheard discussions at the bar. Ruth visited the widow whose testimony Silas had tried to buy. Mrs. Keegan confronted the contractor who had thought to keep quiet. They did more than agree. They acted. Their solidarity was the backbone of our defense. Yet the tricks kept coming. Silas's men came at night and cut a part of the fence, letting a dozen calves stray. They meant to stress us financially and to make us look incompetent. I walked the pasture at dawn with Jace and 3 neighbors and found the calves dazed but alive. We moved quickly and with a steady hand. We counted losses and found them smaller than Silas had hoped. My heart, though, was angry. Anger is a tool if you keep it aimed. The greatest danger came not from Silas's men, but from an inside betrayal we didn't see coming. A young woman who had been a friend of mine and who had been frightened into silence by a deputy's threat came forward with a confession. But under duress, she had signed an affidavit that helped Silas. She broke down crying in front of us, ashamed and terrified and ready to tell the truth. I held her. We fed her soup and then brought her to the judge in the neighboring county. Her account, told with tremor and then with steadiness, gave the judge sufficient grounds to call a hearing in a bigger town, where Silas could not as easily sway the outcome. The forces conspired for a time. We saw it clearly then. Money moved, men were threatened, livelihoods dangled in the balance. But the women of Hartley Hollow conspired back. There was something profoundly simple and fierce about sitting a woman in a chair and having 5 other women promise to look after her family. We set watches, traded favors, and documented every small intimidation. Each time Silas tried to terrorize a family, he got more attention and less compliance. That attention was itself a weapon. A man who had built himself on the quiet fear of others found the quiet fracturing. The townspeople who had been timid began to ask questions in the open. The men in offices who once took bribes felt the law's scrutiny. Silas, furious and flailing, was less the confident Marshal and more a man realizing he'd picked on the wrong woman and the wrong group. I learned in those weeks that courage also looks like arranging rides, making soup, and keeping ledger entries current while your heart wants to snap. The real battle was often administrative, keeping depositions filed, keeping people away from threats, moving evidence to safe hands. In that work, the women were indispensable. There was fear, sure. There were nights of listening for hoofbeats with hands on a gun. There were days of explaining to neighbors why I would not leave, why Tom's death could not be allowed to be just another buried hurt. But there was also the growing hum of a community waking up and saying, with small but loud voices, enough. The forces conspired, as they always will when threatened, but so did solidarity. We had begun to make it costly for a man like Silas to use his badge as mask. The cost would rise. We were prepared to raise it until the man who had thought himself untouchable found himself accountable for his crimes. The night my world narrowed to a single painful point came with rain and a moon that was a pale coin. It seemed as if Silas had been waiting for a moment when the town's attention was elsewhere. Harvest, a funeral, a poker game, where men drank to ease their conscience. He took advantage of that sliver, the way wolves pick the quiet of a back fence. His men rode in under the cover of weather, and one of them, someone I had once considered a neighbor, arrived with a message that felt like a rope around my throat. They came to the house and demanded I hand over the ledger, the one Jace had retrieved and that had always smelled faintly of dust and ink. Silas stood there, all swagger turned sharp. He claimed it was evidence that I had stolen. He claimed I had connived with outlaws. He claimed many things. He also threatened to take my land for back taxes, claiming that Tom's death had left the mortgage in arrears, and that his deputies had the authority to seize. I saw then the cruel geometry of power. He could not arrest truth, but he could make survival a cotton-thin line. Lose the ledger and maybe the law can't prove anything. Keep the ledger and he could make the mortgage impossible. He tried both maneuvers. He threatened to arrest Jace for vagrancy, to indict me for conspiracy, to take everything Tom and I had built and burn it down. There were men behind him, and among them was a face I had trusted, a neighbor who had sold cattle to Silas for profit. "Bend a knee and ask us to show mercy," he said, voice syrupy with the pleasure of being feared. "Ask to keep your home, and we'll be generous." The ledger felt heavy in my pocket like a stone with a name on it. I had a choice. I could hand it over in exchange for a promise, and promises by men like Silas are often thin as straw. Or I could refuse and watch them tear into our life. The choice cut like cold. Jace stepped forward before I could force my voice into armor. He tried to bargain, and they knocked him down with a sneer. One of his old habits, a reflex born of blood and hunger, wanted to explode into violence. I put my hand on his arm and felt him shiver like a horse at the tension of a snare. "Don't," I said. My voice was small but steady. "We have time, we have a plan, but there are moments when the practical plan shudders against the rawness of fear." The deputy, cowardly and ugly, grabbed one of my ledger pages and threatened to burn it, to tear out the parts that could convict Silas. He eyed my hands as if I were an animal he could whip into silence. My blood turned to ice. I thought of Tom and how he had fallen. For a breath, the fear sideswiped me. I had been prepared for strategy, but not this naked attempt to erase a life. Will, the man who had been bribed and then unstuck by our aide, stood in the doorway and stopped the deputy with a tremor in his voice. He refused to sign away the truth now, having seen what protecting the bully meant for others. The deputy snarled and knuckled him in the jaw, and Will went down like a man learning to bleed for a cause. The sight of him collapsed something inside me. It was the clearest picture of everything at stake. Men broken by fear and women trying to keep life together. In the chaos, the ledger got torn. Not all of it, but pages. I felt the world rearrange into a lattice of loss. The deputy stomped the papers as if paper were the body of a man. I grabbed what I could salvage and looked at the missing pieces like teeth knocked out. The law has a brutality that feels human, and in that instant, I felt like the smallest thing a man could crush. It was the darkest hour, not because I was alone, but because I had thought my plan neat and the world reasonable. I had imagined a courtroom and signatures and the judge's pen. Instead, I had a deputy with a burn mark on his hand and a smug marshal who thought himself clever. I had a ledger repaired but with gaps. I had a neighbor who'd signed a false affidavit. I had men who had once been friends now wanting to preserve their own skins, at the cost of truth. We retreated, bloodied but intact. Jace and I tended Will and reassembled the ledger as best we could. We took what pages remained to the judge in the neighboring county, but the missing pages meant we had a weaker file. Silas used it to smear our credibility. The town murmured, and some fingers began once again to point at the widow who had tried to make trouble. It was easy then, in the dimness of that night, to think that the whole edifice might come down. I lay awake and listened to the rain, and thought of the ledger pages like fallen birds. I felt the old fear rise. Fear that I would lose my land, the mortgage, the small memories of Tom. It was a human thing to feel afraid, but in that darkness, there was also something hardening. I had expected to break. I had thought perhaps I'd curl and let the men in badge and greed have what they wanted. That option felt less likely as the night wore on. I saw in my mind the faces of women who had trusted me. Ruth with her pragmatic hands, Eliza who had a voice like a bell, Mrs. Keegan who had argued for bread and fairness. I thought of Will and his children who now had to leave town. There was no space for surrender. Losing would be letting not only myself be erased, but every woman who'd lent her courage be made smaller. "Stand up," I told Jace at dawn, though my voice cracked like old wood. "We finish what we start." He looked at me, tired and furious. And in the set of his mouth, I saw a man who had been hardened by the night, and yet softened by choosing to be on my side. "Then we continue," he said. "We don't do this half-measured." It was a promise. The darkest hour had not broken us. It had clarified the cost. We had bared our ribs to the world and lived. It would not be enough to have good intentions. We needed to create a public account that could not be battered away with brute force or bought with coin. The next steps had to be surgical and unrelenting. After the night of broken pages, every plan we made had to account for cunning and for cruelty. We moved as women and as strategists. We were no longer a small band of conspirators and a tired outlaw. We were a focused force with tactics and heart. There is an art to leading a charge that does not look like aggression. You gather strength, you call allies, you turn spite into a stepping stone. I held a meeting in the barn one afternoon, calling the women who had stood with me and a few men whose conscience outweighed their fear. The hay smelled of late summer and horses. The air was full of dust motes that looked like little stars. We sat in a circle and I outlined the plan, the sort of simple, cunning thing a woman with a ledger and a marrow of stubbornness does. We would take to the county seat with what we had left and present not only the ledger, but also witnesses who would speak to the patterns of Silas's tyranny. We would arrange for out-of-town journalists. News spreads differently in a nearby city, and their editors loved a story of a corrupted lawman to be there. We would publicize the hearing and make it impossible for Silas to quietly buy a clerk or ghost a testimony. Most importantly, we would create a network. Women who could travel and testify that they had been pressured, chosen to tell, and willing to speak in public. Jace objected to journalists at first. Exposure meant danger. He was right, but I argued that transparency created protection. When more eyes are on a man, he acts more carefully. We balanced risk with presence. He agreed because he trusted the method I had chosen and because he had seen me in the darkest hour stand up again. We rode to the county seat in a kind of procession. Women mounted on saddles and men in wagons, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and guarded. The townspeople who had feared Silas watched us pass and in some cases relented into curiosity and then support. When we arrived, there was a hum. People who had not been willing to speak in fear now saw others come forward and felt less alone. At the hearing, I stood and spoke. My voice was not sweetened by drama. It was measured and precise. I laid out the evidences, receipts, ledgers, depositions, witnesses. I read a list of names whose signatures could be accounted for. I did not shout. I told facts. Around me, the women who had supported my cause sat like a row of pillars. Eliza testified about the bribes she had been paid to stay quiet out of fear of losing wages. Ruth described threats men had whispered in alleys. The contractor who had been bought out to ruin our reputation wore a face like a man exposed. Together we were better than the sum of our solitary in the courtroom, looked like a king in a small theater whose script was being interrupted. He sneered and called us liars. He had men testify for him as well, deputies who had been paid and a few cowed neighbors. The judge, however, was a man unfamiliar with his bribery. There was news outside that made the affair public. The reporters wrote with a clarity that makes old wrongs look fresh. The pivotal moment came when a clerk who had been the pocket taken by Silas's money, a clerk I had once given soup to during a winter of fear, stepped forward with a confession. He recounted how Silas had pressured him to move invoices, and how the ledger had been tucked away. His voice shook, but his courage held. The courtroom, which had been a stage for an official theater of lies, began to collapse under the weight of many truths. We did not win at that hearing in the way fairy tales win. There were no trumpets. There were motions and appeals and legal processes that would take months. But we won enough to have a warrant for Silas's arrest and to dislodge some of the deputies who had been his hands. It was a beginning that felt like sunlight after a long wet winter. What was more important was that the women who had once been afraid were now the ones who led the parade back to the hollow. They had testified, and they had been credible because they were truthful. They had not looked for applause or romance. They had looked for justice, and in doing so, they'd changed the story that men in power had told. When Silas was taken into custody a week later, arrested by officers from the neighboring county who had no loyalty to him, he pleaded his innocence loudly enough that some still doubted. But the certainty of his arrest changed the tenor of the hollow. It was not the final note, but it was major. I returned home to a house that had been patched and a ledger that would need mending. Tom's name was lighter in my chest. I went to the grave and smoothed the dirt that had been turned in the winter and talked aloud like a woman aloud now and then. I told him I'd done what we'd promised each other we'd do, not be crushed by the small cruelties of men. Other women came by and brought pies and news. Eliza left the hotel and took over a little cafe in town. Ruth opened a small sewing parlor. We invested in each other. These were not acts of charity, but acts of practical solidarity. We had money from small trusts and payments the community made as a kind of apology to those who had been bullied. I paid off a portion of the mortgage and kept a little more than I needed because I wanted to set aside a fund for women who needed help in times of injustice. Jace and I stood on the porch one evening as the sun rolled down the hills like spilled gold. "You led that room well," he said softly. "There were many voices," I answered. "I just organized them." He shifted closer. "No sudden moves, no claiming. You made me want to be better," he said. "You already were," I corrected, but I let him have his moment. In the years I'd carry forward, there would be a place for him, but not because I needed him to complete me, because he had earned a place beside me by becoming the kind of man who could stand next to a woman who would not be small. That night in the barn, women came to drink coffee and plan a cooperative, a business that would help farmers and women sell goods without being at the mercy of men like Silas. We were, after all, not only surviving, we were building systems to ensure that others would not be damaged in the same way. The weeks following Silas's arrest were like a slow tide pulling secrets into the open. Deputies were questioned. The contractor who had traded favors for rail rights found himself under scrutiny. The court trials were tedious, filled with legal argument and procedural hurdles, but they also burned the banners of a small tyranny. Judges had skin in the game now. Public attention made clean hands more advantageous than crooked ones. In the final trial, the evidence we had gathered, the ledger, the depositions, the hotel receipts, the clerk's confession, took center stage. I sat in the courtroom and watched the room with a focus that felt like muscle. The world had become the thing I had always fought to keep, a place where proofs matter. The defense attempted to smear witnesses and to paint me as a meddling widow who had wanted a man to avenge her. They pulled in old rumors, the kind men like Silas throw around to keep women small. But the power of the case was in the ordinary truths. Men who had once been ashamed to speak now told stories about payments, and men in uniforms who took cattle at night. The contractor's own books betrayed him. There were even men from neighboring counties who testified anonymously about similar patterns where Silas had not been careful enough to hide his tracks. When the jury returned guilty on the charge that mattered, first-degree corruption and conspiracy to commit theft, the sound of it was less shiny than I expected. There was no giddy joy. There was a weight lifted, like a roof beam put in place after a storm. Silas's sentence was not enough to bring Tom back. No sentence could, but it was right. It meant a man who used a badge as a cudgel had to answer for it. It meant the Marshal could no longer roam the valley and pretend he was the law. The victory rippled beyond the hollow. Women who'd once been forced into hush-money arrangements refused to be quiet. Men who'd thought themselves safely crooked found their networks fraying. The judge initiated reforms and called for a review of how deputies were appointed. I was asked to speak at a meeting in the county later about women's rights to property and justice, and I declined at first. Public speaking felt like an exposed nerve, but the women demanded I say something. So I did. I stood before a crowd and spoke with a voice that had learned to carry. I spoke of practicalities, how to keep records, the importance of witnesses, why ledger pages matter. I spoke of women's solidarity, how neighbors could be bought into courage by seeing one another brave. I spoke of how justice was not the property of men, but the work of community. "What would you have done differently?" a woman asked me after, tired and curious. "I would have started sooner," I said, "but I would have sought more allies faster. For the rest, I'd do the same. The point isn't a single act of courage. It's the daily act of not letting a hurt define your life." It was not only the law that changed. The social fabric shifted as well. The hollow was steadier. I paid the mortgage off and kept a small homestead fund to support women in hardship. I established a little legal fund, managed by women, who would help one another with small legal fees and depositions. It was practical because nothing practical is purely noble. And Jace, he did not become a hero of folklore. He became a man who tended fences and mended tools and stood quiet in the kitchen and listened. He and I made a decision one autumn afternoon, not about marriage, but about partnership. We crafted documents, an arrangement that made clear our shared ownership of the work we had built together. He worked the ranch as my partner. I accepted his company as a chosen element of my life. The romance between us was steady and mature, built on mutual respect, not on some rescue fantasy. We had a small ceremony, of sorts, when the first calf of a spring was born under my watch and Jace's steady hand. It felt like a private acknowledgement. A woman who had been broken was made whole in her own way, choosing a man who had proven himself and who was better because of the truths we'd made him face. He respected my choices. He listened. He adapted. Women around the hollow found their own power. Ruth's sewing parlor made a tidy profit. Eliza's cafe became a place where women could speak aloud and be heard. Mrs. Keegan organized a ride system for cattle to markets so nobody had to rely on crooked operators. We made the structure we had needed when Silas ran things into the ground. What stitched my victory to meaning was the way it changed the possibilities for other women. A widow no longer had to be frightened into silence. A woman with a mortgage could look at the ledger and know to keep receipts. The fear that had governed small choices began to look less inevitable. That, perhaps, was the truest triumph. And Tom, his name was not a rallying cry. It was a careful memory. I would visit his grave sometimes and tell him what we'd done. I would tell him, in a voice that did not plead but informed, that his land would be protected. I imagined him smiling, the sort of slow satisfaction he had when a fence was mended. There were losses. Relationships broken could not always be fixed. A few men who had been mute in the face of a lie remained so, and some neighbors left. But the town as a whole was cleaner for the fight. That is justice. Not the wiping away of pain, but the correction of power so the next woman doesn't have to start from the same place. The victory did not render me perfect. I still had flaws. The sharpness of my tongue, my occasional impatience, my stubbornness. They were mine to manage. Jace would sometimes prod me. "Take tea, Hartley," he'd say. And I would. He would sometimes point out a long view I had not considered. And I would sometimes look at the horizon and think of other things to mend. Time, like horses, moves steady and without apology. A year turned. 2. The house had new shingles and the porch had been widened. I kept Tom's name on the deed because his hands had shaped the land and because erasing a life didn't unmake it. The mortgage had been paid. The legal fund we'd organized had a modest sum. We had started a small cooperative where women took turns riding goods to town and pitching in for supplies. I taught a class on practical law keeping, how to keep receipts, how to take statements, and when to seek counsel. Women came. They were of different ages, some older than me, some younger, but their faces carried the same seriousness. Jace and I ran the ranch together. We had a partnership agreement, written because I had learned to love the clarity of paper. He had ownership of a small portion of land we had bought together. It was symbolic and practical, a shared stake in a shared future. Our relationship was not the center of my life. It was an important and chosen part of it. We had nights when we argued about fence line decisions, and afternoons when we sat on the porch and read. We had mornings when the coffee was quiet and perfect. Our appearances shifted too, tangible symbols of inner change. I wore my hair shorter now for practical reasons. The ribbon Tom used to knot at my throat was in a drawer like a relic. My hands were rougher in some ways and softer in others, calluses earned by work, tenderness earned by mending. Jace traded his long coat for a practical jacket and kept his hat at a respectful angle. He had learned to carry kindness as carefully as he once carried a rifle. The Hollow had new rhythms. Eliza's cafe buzzed with morning trade and conversation. Ruth's sewing parlor offered employment to young girls who wanted skills. The Women's Fund had aided 5 women in legal matters in 2 years. Our cooperative bought a small lot where women could auction goods without a middleman. The town had not become perfect. It had become fairer in the small ways that matter for daily life. People slept easier. I thought often of the darkest hours, the barn with the man who stumbled into my life, the ledger pages torn, the deputy's rough hands. I thought of the women who had brought blankets and courage. I thought of Will's family who had made a life elsewhere and sent letters in which they spoke of stability, and of Ruth's careful hands that stitched more than cloth. They stitched trust. Those memories had shaped me into a woman who would not be defined by victimhood but by the shape of her choices. Jace and I grew in our parallel redemptions. He hunted no more for past glory. He found a certain contentment in the ordinary tasks of a ranch. I gave him credit for saving himself from a life that had been headed toward a different end, but more importantly, we both salvaged a portion of our futures that might have been denied. He was not my rescue. He was my witness and my partner. Our romance was not dramatic. It was practical and stubborn and kind. We loved in a way that respected our histories and did not expect either of us to be made whole by the other. We had also more quietly become a model for a different kind of mature relationship, one in which equals share burdens and joys. Years later, the Hollow would tell stories about the woman who sheltered an outlaw and forced a corrupt Marshal to answer. The tale would thicken into legend, but the truth was a quieter thing. We had made a ledger matter and made neighbors matter. People would come by to tell me that because of what we'd done, they had a chance to hold their heads high. They would say their daughters knew that being a woman did not mean being small. If I had to sum up what had changed me, it would be this. The day I chose to act rather than be acted upon. The day I decided to keep Tom's memory as a map rather than a shroud. And the day I asked for help and refused to let help become control. Those choices turned grief into a kind of muscle. I learned that there is power in the practical, and in the insistence that fairness be public. To the women who read this, Your life is not a ledger of things lost. It is a ledger of choices, each a line you can write in bold if you wish. You do not have to wait for a cavalry to come. You gather the right documents, speak your truth, and find allies who respect your agency. You are not meant to be rescued. You are meant to be seen. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are. Afterward, I keep the ledger in a box now, the pages a tattered map of a fight that changed my hollow. Sometimes I bring it out and trace names with a mournful fondness and a fierce pride. I tell Tom about the cooperative and the women who left town no longer afraid. I tell Jace, who laughs and calls me stubborn as any name. I tell myself, when nights come long, that being a woman in a world that expects softness is a daily act of defiance, and that defiance, when made with careful hands, builds a life not measured by what was taken, but by what you make of what remains. If you are reading this, know you are not alone. The valley is wide and the work is yours to direct. There will be nights when the ledger pages tear. There will be neighbors who fear. There will be men who will try to make law into a cudgel. But gather the women, tend the wounds, keep the records, speak your truth and make your choices. Build an alliance with a person who sees you as whole, not as someone to save. In the end, you are the keeper of your life, and that is the most dangerous and the most beautiful truth of all.